Hello and welcome to the fourth edition of our Investment Insight series, Magellan Minutes. Unfortunately, due to COVID, we've found ourselves broadcasting via Zoom yet again. These challenging times continue, but we're hopeful that we'll be back in the studio again very soon. My name is Jennifer Herbert, Key Account Manager at Magellan, and in this session, I'll be talking with Adrian Lu, one of our investment analysts. We'll be discussing cybersecurity, the computer chip shortage, and how SAP is tracking in the current environment. Thanks for joining us, Adrian.
Thanks, Jen. It's good to see you again, as always.
Adrian, last time we caught up, we talked about cybersecurity and some of the issues that Microsoft and other enterprise software companies were facing. Do you have any updates to share with us?
Yeah, there's been quite a lot happening here. I think one of the most consequential events was the public announcement just last month of a security vulnerability in a piece of Java software called Log4j. And what makes this one so consequential is that Log4j runs effectively everywhere. It's an open source software framework by the Apache Software Foundation that's used by other software applications to provide event monitoring and recording. And because it runs so innocuously in the background, most end users, including myself, would typically not even realize that our favorite software package is actually running Log4j.
And so what makes this vulnerability so important, and have they found a solution?
Well, it basically allows bad actors to gain control and run malicious instructions on the target computer. So the scope is actually quite wide here. It could be used for stealing data, installing backdoors, or using the target machine for other nefarious purposes. And what's also scary about this vulnerability is how relatively easy it is to exploit and how widespread it is. And yeah, there have been a series of fixes that have been released over the past month, but it is up to vendors in the software and hardware supply chains to implement those fixes. And then it's up to customers to make sure all their software is up to date. And that's the part I think will take a little bit more time to play out.
Sure. And have there been any consequences of this on Magellan's portfolio stocks, like Microsoft, which has it's been a strong performer in the global fund?
Yeah, I think this vulnerability is so pervasive that it touches actually most companies in one way or another. And I don't mean just the tech companies. So it'll be a matter of how quickly companies are to respond. And as I mentioned, it's still relatively early days. Now, Microsoft actually has a threat intelligence center that's been tracking the spike in activity by different hacking groups around the world. And these groups are actually scanning to find systems that are vulnerable that they can take advantage of and exploit. Microsoft itself have rolled out fixes for its own software. And so far, it hasn't identified any sort of exploitation of its enterprise services. But it did have some exposure on the consumer side on its Minecraft gaming services, which have since been fixed. But other than that, Microsoft's continued to show good momentum across its businesses. They recently announced their largest gaming acquisition of Activision Blizzard, which will go towards supporting their differentiated cloud gaming strategy. But aside from that, I think the only businesses that have seen any growth headwinds recently have been the Windows and hardware businesses. And that's because of chip shortages in the supply chain, which is really out of Microsoft's control.
Okay, I'm glad that you mentioned the computer chip shortage, because we've been hearing a lot about this since the pandemic started. Why has there been such a shortage in computer chips?
It's definitely made a lot of headlines, and I wish I could point to a single cause. But the situation we find ourselves in is really a confluence of several factors. So when the threat of COVID became more widespread in early 2020 and lockdowns were just beginning, nobody really knew what to expect. And product manufacturers were bracing for some serious demand contraction, and none more so than the automotive industry, but you saw that in other industries as well. And as a consequence, we saw companies reducing their orders for key inputs, including computer chips, and reducing their production capacity and inventory. But as we now know, the demand for goods consumption turned out stronger than ever. And we saw this across a lot of product categories, including PCs, where Microsoft has exposure. And then laid on top of that is that the global demand for chips is also rising structurally. So I think major trends like cloud and edge computing, 5G, IoT, just more and more chips in products. So this isn't just a short-term cyclical phenomenon. It's actually a long-term trend as well.
And why has it taken so long for supply to meet demand?
Well, there actually is a lot of capacity building going on around the world at this point, but the stuff has really long lead times. So it can take a couple of years or more to build new chip capacity from scratch. And the other factor is that these supply chains are quite complex. So delays in one part of the supply chain can hold up others. And a good example of that is the companies that make the tools that you need to make the chips. Those tools need chips themselves. And so this shortage actually comes full circle. And then in between all of this, we've had the effect of lockdowns impacting factory operations in the supply chain, including companies that package and test these chips in Southeast Asia, for example. So it's another thing that holds things up.
Okay, it sounds pretty complicated. So how long do you think before this supply imbalance starts to normalize?
Well, the general expectation is that the shortage starts to resolve during the second half of this year, but some expect the shortage to last well into 2023. And I suspect it will depend on the industry as well. But it is worth noting that it's not all chips that are in short supply. So there are pockets where there aren't enough chips, and these have tended to be the more simple or lower end components, but they've also been the more essential components as well, which means that as a company, even if you have all the other components you need to build your car, for example, that one simple component prevents you from completing the build and holds up the entire product line.
Okay, well, that's one we'll be watching keenly to see how it all shapes out. Finally, Adrian, moving away from chips and cybersecurity to one of our enterprise software holdings, SAP, what's the latest there?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. SAP has been showing promising results over the past year since they reset their medium-term outlook. And one of the key metrics that investors, including ourselves, are watching is SAP's cloud growth momentum, particularly in its core software application known as S/4HANA. Now, some of our listeners may recall that SAP launched its new cloud offering during the first quarter of 2021, so a year ago now. And we've seen cloud growth accelerate every quarter since that launch. And the most recent quarter, was no exception. We had cloud up 24% in constant currency, but importantly, the core S/4HANA cloud accelerated and grew over 60%. Now, granted, this is off a small base relative to the overall business. S/4HANA Cloud is a 1.3 billion euro run rate business in a 28 billion organization. And so the company's overall margin trajectory is also going to be a key metric to watch. But these are positive signs nonetheless, and we'll continue to watch them.
Adrian, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today, and thank you to everyone for watching. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact one of the Magellan distribution team, and feel free to share this update with clients or colleagues as you see fit. Take care and stay safe.